Tokyo, August 9th, 1945. 10:45 a.m. The corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters still smelled faintly of smoke and lacquer from the previous night's air raid. Officers moved stiffly through the underground war rooms, their uniforms damp with sweat. The air conditioning had failed again, another reminder that the great war machine of the Empire was running on exhaustion and prayer. Colonel Hidenari, Hirosaki set his teacup down as a messenger burst through the steel door, clutching a decoded transmission from the Southern Region Command. The boy was barely 20, pale beneath his cap. He saluted, trembling. "From Kyushu," he stammered. "Immediate priority, unverified, but significant." General Torashiro Kawabe took the paper, his face expressionless. The officers around the table, Intelligence, Army Air Service, Communications, watched as his eyes scanned the lines. Then, for the first time in 3 days, Kawabe exhaled sharply through his nose. "Another explosion," he said. The room went still. "Where?" asked an air defense colonel. "Nagasaki." For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the distant rumble of trains in the subway tunnels beneath the city. "Another," the communications officer whispered. "Another like Hiroshima?" Kawabe didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the flimsy sheet again. The report from the 5th Air Division was fragmented. A radio man's last words broken by static. A blinding flash, heat. "Cannot see the city." "Nagasaki." The signal had died in mid-sentence. A major leaned forward. "Could it be a secondary explosion? The Mitsubishi torpedo works?" The suggestion hung in the air, thin and desperate. Kawabe folded the message carefully and placed it on the map table. "We thought Hiroshima was an ammunition depot too," he said quietly. No one met his eyes. By noon, the war room was choked with heat and speculation. Officers passed between rooms carrying more decoded intercepts. All the same, communications from southern Japan breaking off mid-transmission. Coastal posts reporting massive plumes rising over the western horizon. Pilots claiming to see a pillar of smoke piercing the clouds, but there were no details. No photographs, no survivors yet. Just fragments. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, the Army's intelligence chief, wiped his face with a handkerchief and snapped, "We need confirmation before spreading panic." The Americans have been dropping leaflets again. "Perhaps this is psychological warfare," another officer muttered. "If it is, they've learned how to make the sky burn." Someone laughed, short, nervous, and immediately cut off. In another part of the compound, Admiral Toyota, chief of the Navy General Staff, stood before a wall map marked with pins and red thread. Hiroshima was already circled in black ink, a gaping wound on the map. Now a second circle was being drawn around Nagasaki. 2 black circles, 2 vanished cities. He felt the absurd urge to draw a third. "Just to get ahead of fate, sir," said his aide. "The Americans broadcast this morning. They announced the destruction of Hiroshima with a new kind of bomb. They claim to have more." Toyota's jaw tightened. "Propaganda. Their radios lie as easily as ours. Yet Hiroshima is gone." The Admiral's hand trembled slightly. "Perhaps," he said, "but even if true, they cannot have many. Such a weapon must require enormous resources." He turned back to the map. His mind, trained to measure fleets and tonnage, refused to grasp the idea of annihilation from the air. A single aircraft erasing an entire city. That was not how wars were fought. It was not how the universe worked. At 1 p.m., a courier from the Imperial Palace arrived, escorted by gendarmes. He carried a sealed envelope bearing the chrysanthemum crest. The guard saluted as he entered the underground briefing room. General Anami, the war minister, broke the seal and read in silence. His face remained a mask, but the corners of his mouth twitched once. The only betrayal of emotion. "The Emperor requests a full report on Hiroshima," he said at last, "and clarification regarding rumors of a second catastrophe in Kyushu." The word rumors lingered in the air like smoke. Rumors, that was all these. Disasters were allowed to be until the Emperor himself acknowledged them. "Tell His Majesty," Irisu said, "we are verifying. The situation remains fluid." Anami folded the message again, his thumb pressing hard against the paper. "Fluid?" he said softly. "The Empire itself is melting. Outside, the city sweltered under an August haze. Radio Tokyo continued broadcasting martial anthems and victory slogans between coded weather reports. The announcers' voices were firm, rehearsed, dead behind the teeth, but the people in the streets already knew something was wrong. The black market gossip moved faster than the army's couriers. A new bomb, a city gone, the Americans demanding surrender. In the basement of the WWII building, an air defense operator stared at his radar screen. It was almost empty, just the slow crawl of weather echoes. The great armadas of B-29s that had terrorized Japan's nights were gone. That was what frightened him most. "Where are they?" he whispered. "Why aren't they coming?" His supervisor didn't answer. The Americans didn't need hundreds of bombers anymore. One would do. By late afternoon, the Imperial Conference was convened in a tense, airless chamber beneath the palace. The 6 men of the Supreme War Council, the Big Six, sat around the polished table, their faces drawn and gray. Prime Minister Suzuki opened with a report from the Army General Staff. "There is considerable evidence," he said carefully, "that a new weapon was used at Hiroshima, and possibly again today at Nagasaki. The scale of destruction is unprecedented. Entire areas have been obliterated." Foreign Minister Togo cleared his throat. "The Americans claim to possess more such bombs. They have warned that unless Japan surrenders, they will continue." "Propaganda," snapped General Umezu, the chief of the Army General Staff. "They seek to weaken our resolve before the decisive homeland battle. We must not be deceived." "General," Togo said, "Hiroshima was not deception." The old man's knuckles whitened. "Then we will fight in the ruins." Anami spoke quietly, his deep voice cutting through the room. "To fight in the ruins, we must still have a homeland left to defend." The men avoided each other's eyes. No one dared mention the Soviet declaration of war the day before, the Red Army already pouring into Manchuria. 2 disasters in 48 hours, one from the east, one from the sky. Evening came. The electric lights flickered in the war room as Tokyo's generators strained under another blackout. At 7 p.m., a radio operator shouted from the communications pit, "We have voice transmission from Momura Airfield, Kyushu." The officers crowded around. Through static and crackle came a hoarse voice. "Massive damage to Nagasaki. Entire city burning. Unable to locate command center. Casualties beyond estimate." Then silence. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Kawabe said, "So it's true." He looked up at the ceiling, as if the tons of concrete above might collapse under the weight of the revelation. 2 cities gone, both in daylight, both with a single aircraft sighted. The same pattern, Colonel Terasaki whispered, "If they can do this again tomorrow, there will be no Japan left to defend." Night deepened over Tokyo. The Emperor's private secretary, Koichi Kido, sat alone in his office, writing in his diary by the light of a single candle. He had just come from an audience with His Majesty. Hirohito had listened in silence as Kido relayed the reports, the American announcement, the 2nd destroyed city. When Kido finished, the Emperor had asked only one question: "Can we endure another?" Kido had no answer. Now, as he dipped his brush, he recorded the moment with painful precision. "His Majesty shows deep concern for the people. It appears he considers the time may soon come to end the war." He paused, the ink bleeding into the paper. Somewhere above, the city shuddered with a distant explosion. An ammunition dump struck by accident, perhaps. The sound rolled through the underground corridors like thunder. It sounded like the world ending again. Just after midnight, the liaison office received an intercepted American broadcast from Guam. It confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The weapon dropped on Nagasaki was the same type used on Hiroshima. Another atomic bomb. The words atomic bomb had no meaning in Japanese. The translators struggled. One suggested Genshi Bakudan, a primitive coinage that would later enter every history book. Kawabe read the translation aloud. The silence that followed felt like mourning. Arisue said quietly, "If they can produce them in numbers, our defenses are meaningless." "Numbers?" Kawabe echoed. "They only need 1 for each city." He looked around at his fellow officers, men who had fought for 8 years, who had seen China, Burma, the Philippines fall. They had accepted firebombing, starvation, defeat, but this was something different. This was the end of everything they understood about war and honor. For the first time, Kawabe thought of his wife and children, and of Tokyo itself. Still standing for now, waiting its turn, he whispered, "Maybe the Americans are no longer fighting us. Maybe they are erasing us." Tokyo, August 10th, 1945. Dawn. The sky above the Imperial Palace was pale and washed with humidity, a color somewhere between ash and pearl. Crows perched on the blackened ruins beyond the moat, picking at charred scraps left from the last air raid. Inside the underground compound, the war rooms were still lit. No one had slept. The air was stale with tobacco and fear. General Korichika Anami stood at the far end of the conference table, reading the latest situation reports. His hand, large and scarred from a lifetime of sword drills, gripped the paper so tightly that it trembled. Beside him, a wall clock ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like the Empire's final ones. "Omura Airfield confirms," said Colonel Terasaki. "Nagasaki is gone. Total destruction within a 2-kilometer radius. Fires continue to burn out of control. Casualty estimates exceed 70% of the population." The room remained silent. Even those who had doubted Hiroshima could no longer pretend. "How?" muttered one air defense officer. "One plane. Always one." "The Americans call it the atomic bomb," replied another. "A single device with the power of—" He hesitated, searching for the word. "Of the sun." The silence that followed was broken only by the whir of a distant generator. Someone's hand brushed a teacup and porcelain cracked. General Umezu, the Army Chief of Staff, exhaled heavily. "Even so, we cannot assume they have more than 2. If this was their final weapon, we must press for decisive defense on the mainland." "Defense?" Anami's voice was flat. "With what?" "The Soviets are advancing through Manchuria. Our northern armies are collapsing. And if the Americans possess even one more of these—" He didn't finish the thought. The words hung there like smoke, unspoken yet burning through every man's mind. At 8 a.m., an imperial messenger arrived bearing a note written in the delicate calligraphy of the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal. Yoichi Kido. It requested the immediate presence of the War Minister and the Foreign Minister at the Imperial Palace. The Emperor wished to be briefed personally. Anami and Togo left the bunker in silence, escorted by 2 guards through the damp corridors toward the courtyard. The sudden daylight blinded them. The smell of the garden, pine and stagnant water, felt unreal after so many hours underground. They were driven in an open car through the palace gates, past soldiers who saluted mechanically. Even the cherry trees looked weary. In the imperial study, Emperor Hirohito sat before a lacquered desk, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. He was dressed in a simple military tunic. A single fan hummed beside him, stirring the heavy air. Anami bowed deeply until his forehead touched the floor. Togo followed, his heart pounding. When they rose, the Emperor gestured for them to sit. "I have been told," Hirohito said quietly, "that another city has been destroyed." "Yes, Majesty," said Togo. "Nagasaki." The Emperor's gaze lowered to the papers before him. "Do we know how many died?" "No accurate number yet, Majesty. But we believe the destruction is total." He nodded once, slowly. "And this weapon, does our science understand it?" Anami hesitated. "Our scientists say such a device would require quantities of uranium we cannot produce." They believed it impossible. The Emperor's eyes lifted. "Impossible? And yet it has happened twice." No one answered. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each sound a reminder that the universe no longer obeyed the rules Japan had trusted. Finally, Hirohito spoke again. "If the enemy can destroy cities in an instant, then continuing the war will only mean the extinction of our people. We must consider the path of peace." Anami felt the blood drain from his face. "Majesty, to surrender unconditionally would mean the end of the Kokutai, the national essence, the divine sovereignty." The Emperor's tone did not rise, but the force of his words silenced him. "If we lose the people," he said, "there will be no Kokutai to preserve." Togo bowed deeply. "I will prepare the terms for communication to the Allies, Your Majesty." As they left, Anami's steps were heavy, as if each carried the weight of 1,000 soldiers' ghosts. He had sworn to die before seeing Japan surrender, Now even death felt inadequate. Back in the underground complex, rumors spread like wildfire. Some officers whispered that the emperor wished to end the war. Others denied it, insisting it was Allied propaganda. Radios hummed with intercepted broadcasts from Guam and Saipan, confirming that the Americans had issued another ultimatum: surrender or face further atomic devastation. In one corner of the operations room, a group of young airmen argued furiously. "They are bluffing," one shouted. "They cannot have many of these bombs." "But what if they do?" another replied. "They could strike Tokyo next." "If they strike Tokyo," the first said bitterly, "then perhaps the army will finally stop debating." The laughter that followed was hollow and frightened. By noon, the Supreme War Council reconvened. The 6 men sat beneath a portrait of Emperor Meiji, the founder of the modern empire. His painted eyes seemed to watch them with judgment. Foreign Minister Togo read the draft of a telegram to Switzerland, to be passed to the Allies via neutral channels. It expressed Japan's willingness to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, with one condition: the preservation of the emperor's position. When he finished, silence fell. Prime Minister Suzuki spoke first. "If we do not accept, Tokyo may be next. His Majesty wishes peace." Umezu slammed his fist on the table. "Peace at what cost? To surrender under these terms is to hand our divine emperor to the enemy. Better that the nation perish." "Perish?" Togo's voice shook with fury. "You would have the entire race destroyed for your pride? Better extinction than humiliation," Umezu hissed. Anami's deep voice broke in. "Enough." He looked around the table, his eyes shadowed. "I understand the horror of surrender, but we are no longer speaking of victory or defeat. We are speaking of survival itself. Every day we delay, tens of thousands die." The room went quiet again. For the first time, no one dared contradict him. As the council deliberated, the air raid sirens wailed above Tokyo. Everyone froze. Then the loudspeakers announced the all clear. False alarm. Only one B-29 had been sighted near Yokohama, circling at high altitude. No bombs were dropped, but the symbolism was unbearable. Even a single enemy plane now made the entire capital hold its breath. In the communications center, a young officer stared at the radar screen, remembering the last time one plane had appeared alone. The men around him said nothing. That evening, the emperor summoned the Privy Council. For the first time since the war began, Hirohito himself would speak on policy, an unprecedented act. He entered the chamber quietly, without fanfare. The room rose as one. He began softly, but his words carried the weight of centuries. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is incalculable. Should we continue to fight, it would result not only in the destruction of our nation, but also in the obliteration of human civilization. He paused, his gaze steady. "I have resolved to bear the unbearable." Those present bowed their heads. Some wept silently. Others stared at the floor, unable to accept that the divine voice of the emperor had just chosen surrender. Later that night, in the dim corridors of the War Ministry, anger brewed. A circle of young officers, fanatically loyal to the ideal of death before dishonor, whispered of betrayal. "The emperor is being misled," one said. "The politicians have poisoned His Majesty's mind." Another clenched his fists. "If we lose the Kokutai, what meaning does Japan have? Better to die as warriors than live as slaves." The plan was whispered: to storm the palace, prevent the surrender broadcast, preserve the honor of the army. It was madness born of devotion and despair. Far away in the city, civilians huddled around their radios, unaware that within a few days their emperor would speak to them directly. And for the first time in history, they would hear his voice. Near midnight, Anami walked alone through the empty corridors of the palace compound. Outside, the cicadas droned, indifferent to the collapse of empires. He thought of his soldiers, the boys digging trenches along the beaches of Kyushu, clutching bamboo spears, waiting for an invasion that would never come. He thought of his own oath, to protect the emperor, to die for the nation. But what did protection mean now, when death itself had changed shape? No longer a battlefield, but a light that erased everything it touched. He entered a small office lit by a single lamp and sat at the desk. On the paper before him, he began to write his will. The brush moved slowly but without hesitation. I, with my death, humbly apologize to His Majesty for the great crime. He paused, staring at the ink as it bled into the fibers. Then he added, I die with no regrets for my country. He placed the paper carefully in an envelope and sealed it with wax. Outside, thunder rumbled. But no rain came, only the endless, oppressive heat of August. In the final hours before dawn, Tokyo was silent except for the hum of generators beneath the earth. Within those walls, the last illusions of divine protection had begun to crumble. The men who had believed the gods would shield Japan now stared into the void of their own powerlessness. 2 cities were gone. A third could vanish at any moment. The empire of the rising sun was standing at the edge of night, and the dawn that awaited it would not be of victory, but of surrender. Would not be of victory, but of surrender. Tokyo, August 11th, 1945. Morning brought no light, only a dull gray that hung over the city like smoke that refused to rise. The air was heavy, unmoving, saturated with fear. Inside the underground command center of the Imperial General Headquarters, the men of the Big Six sat again around the same table, their eyes hollow, their uniforms wrinkled with sleeplessness. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo read aloud the latest response from the Allies, received through Switzerland. The paper trembled in his hands. The Allies accept Japan's surrender, provided that the authority of the Emperor shall be subject to the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. He lowered the sheet, and the silence that followed was more terrible than shouting. Subject to, repeated General Umezu, his voice rough with disbelief. They mean to treat His Majesty as a prisoner. Prime Minister Suzuki spoke softly, or as a symbol perhaps, but alive. Japan will continue. Umezu struck the table with his fist. Continue as what? A vassal state? A corpse dressed in silk? Togo rubbed his temples. The Emperor wishes only to save his people. He has made his will clear. Across the table, General Anami stared at the document without speaking. His face was pale and rigid, as if carved from stone. Inside him, loyalty and despair were at war. He had sworn to die before allowing Japan's humiliation. Yet the Emperor himself now sought peace. To defy that would mean betraying his God. To obey it meant betraying every soldier who had died shouting his name. He whispered, "There is no victory left to protect, only obedience." Outside the war rooms, life in Tokyo had collapsed into a stunned quiet. Trams ran half-empty, their wheels squealing over cracked rails. Children dug through the ruins of burned neighborhoods for scraps of copper and iron. Rumors spread faster than truth, that another bomb would fall, that the Emperor was dead, that the Americans were already landing in Kyushu. In the barracks, soldiers listened in silence to the whispers of surrender. Some wept, others sharpened their bayonets and said nothing. One young officer, Lieutenant Hatanaka, slammed his fist against the wall. "If we surrender," he told his comrades, "we betray the souls of the fallen. The war must go on, for the honor of the Empire. If nothing else," his friend looked at him and said quietly, "The Empire is already burning." August 12th, at the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito met again with Koichi Kido, his trusted advisor. The Emperor's eyes were ringed with exhaustion, but his voice was calm. "I have decided," he said. "The war must end. The suffering is too great. Every moment we delay, more die without purpose." Kido bowed deeply. "Your Majesty's mercy will save the nation, but there are those who will resist even your will." Hirohito looked toward the window, where sunlight fell across the floor in thin bars. "Then it is their hearts, not mine, that must change. Prepare the rescript. I will speak to my people." The decision, once made, spread through the palace like a whisper of wind before a storm. The Emperor would record a message, to be broadcast by radio, announcing Japan's surrender. It would be the first time in history his subjects would hear his voice. But as word leaked, so did rage. In the shadows of the War Ministry, a conspiracy began to form. August 13th. The city boiled with rumors. Allied leaflets fluttered through the streets, urging civilians to demand peace. The Americans promised mercy. The Soviets, now invading from the north, promised none. In the underground rooms of the Ministry of War, Young officers gathered again under flickering lamps. Their leader, Major Kenji Hatanaka, spoke in a trembling voice. The peace faction has betrayed the Emperor. They are forcing His Majesty to surrender. We cannot allow this. But His Majesty himself, one officer began. Hatanaka slammed his hand on the table. His Majesty's mind has been clouded by weak men. The spirit of Japan must be protected from such treachery. If we seize the palace and prevent the broadcast, we can save the nation. A heavy silence followed. Some nodded. Others looked away, terrified by the words, but even more terrified by defeat. By midnight, the plan was in motion. August 14th, 1945, the day before surrender. The palace grounds glowed faintly under the moonlight. Guards whispered among themselves, uneasy without knowing why. Inside, the Emperor rehearsed his message in a quiet room with the NHK recording technicians. The microphone, polished and gleaming, stood like a sacred object between them. Hirohito's voice was soft, measured, filled with sorrow. To our good and loyal subjects, after pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation. The technicians wept as he read on. The Emperor spoke of enduring the unendurable, of preventing the total extinction of mankind. When he finished, no one moved for several seconds. The wax discs were sealed in protective boxes to be broadcast the next day at noon. Outside the room, the courtiers bowed as he passed. No one dared meet his eyes. They all understood. The divine voice had already stepped down from heaven, but the night was far from over. At 11:30 p.m., Major Hatanaka and his men moved toward the palace gates. They wore their uniforms immaculate, their pistols gleaming. Under false orders, they convinced the guard regiment to stand aside. The coup had begun. Inside, loyal officers scrambled to warn the palace staff. The telephone lines were cut. The conspirators spread through the corridors, searching for the recording of the Emperor's speech. In their minds, they were not betraying him. They were saving him from surrender. In the dim hallways, the sound of boots echoed like distant thunder. General Anami sat alone in his quarters at the Ministry of War, the same letter still lying on his desk, his resignation and apology to the Emperor. He knew of the coup forming outside, perhaps even sympathized with its despair, but he had made his decision. The clock struck midnight. He unbuttoned his tunic, drew his short sword, and knelt before the portrait of the Emperor. For a long moment he remained still, head bowed. Then he plunged the blade into his abdomen with both hands. His aide entered minutes later to find him slumped forward, lifeless, blood soaking the tatami mat. The man who had once embodied Japan's will to fight was gone. His death in silence was both an apology and a plea for peace. Back at the palace, chaos reigned. Hatanaka's men searched frantically for the recorded discs. They overturned desks, ripped open drawers, interrogated servants at gunpoint. But the recordings had already been hidden by a loyal chamberlain, Yoshihiro Tokugawa, who slipped them into a linen basket and carried them to the basement of the Imperial Household Ministry. There, under guard, they waited for dawn. Hatanaka, unaware, believed victory was within reach. He demanded to see War Minister Anami, not knowing the man was already dead. As dawn approached, the coup began to crumble. Outside, loyal troops surrounded the palace gates. A standoff ensued, tense and wordless. At 4 a.m., the Eastern Army commander, General Shizuichi Tanaka, arrived in person. His voice thundered through the courtyard. "Put down your weapons. The war is over. This rebellion dishonors the Emperor." Hatanaka froze, the weight of futility crushing him. His men began to lower their rifles. Some wept. Others simply stood, hollow-eyed, staring at the rising light. By 8 a.m., the coup was over. Hatanaka fled through the streets on a stolen motorcycle, a pistol at his side. When he reached the NHK radio building, he pleaded for airtime to explain himself, to tell the nation that he had only wanted to protect its soul. The broadcasters refused. He stepped outside, bowed once to the imperial palace in the distance, and shot himself through the heart. In his pocket they found a note. "I did it for my country. Long live the Emperor." As the sun climbed higher, Tokyo stirred from the night's chaos, unaware of how close the empire had come to implosion. The wax recordings were delivered safely to NHK headquarters. Soldiers guarded the studio as if it contained the nation's last breath. In the imperial palace, The emperor stood by the window, gazing toward the city. Smoke rose faintly from the horizon, the ghosts of Nagasaki and Hiroshima lingering in the morning air. Koichi Kido approached quietly. "It is time, Majesty," the emperor nodded. "Then let them hear." At noon on August 15, 1945, the people of Japan gathered around their radios. The static cleared, and a voice unlike any they had heard filled the air, formal, distant, and sorrowful. Hirohito's words flowed slowly, archaic and heavy with grace. He spoke of bearing the unbearable, of enduring the unendurable, of preserving peace for the generations to come. Many listeners could not fully understand the language, but they understood the tone. It was not the sound of command. It was the sound of an ending. In homes across the country, men and women fell to their knees. Soldiers wept openly. Children stared in silence as their parents bowed to the unseen voice. And in the bunkers beneath Tokyo, the officers who had denied reality now listened to it. Some sat in stunned silence. Others tore off their caps and cried out in grief or rage. A few simply stared at the wall, lips moving soundlessly as if praying to gods who had stopped answering. That night, the emperor's palace was silent again. The decision had been made, the divine mandate fulfilled in a whisper that spanned the nation. Japan's illusion of invincibility was gone. The divine protection had vanished with the flash over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tokyo, August 15, 1945. Afternoon. The broadcast had ended an hour ago, but the city had not yet found its breath. In the streets, the summer air was unnaturally still. People stood frozen beside radios, the final echoes of the emperor's voice lingering like smoke after a fire. The words were ancient and distant, endure the unendurable, yet their meaning struck with the force of a bomb. For the first time in its history, Japan had surrendered. In a narrow alley behind the Ministry of Communications, a group of soldiers knelt beside their truck, heads bowed. One of them clutched his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. "So, it's over?" he whispered. His sergeant nodded without looking up. "The emperor has spoken," another soldier spat into the dust. "Then why does the sky still look the same?" No one answered. The war had ended, but the world hadn't changed. Not yet. Inside the imperial palace, the corridors were hushed. The men who had ruled Japan's fate now walked as ghosts among ghosts. Papers lay scattered across tables, orders that would never be carried out, invasion plans that would never be executed. The telephones, once ringing endlessly, were silent. In a dim chamber, Prime Minister Suzuki sat slumped at his desk, staring at a single candle. "It is done," he murmured. "The Empire has spoken its last command." Foreign Minister Togo entered quietly. His uniform was unbuttoned, his hair disheveled. He placed a folded message on the desk. The Allies' formal acknowledgement of Japan's surrender. "They have accepted," he said softly. Suzuki nodded without looking. "Then we will live. Though I wonder if any of us will know how." Togo's eyes filled with tears. "We must, for the children who still believe in tomorrow." Far below them, in the bunker that had once housed the war's beating heart, General Kawabe and his staff stood before a blank wall map. The red threads that once marked Japan's armies stretched uselessly now, thin veins feeding into nothing. Kawabe removed his cap and set it on the table. "Erase it," he said. A junior officer hesitated. "Sir, the map," Kawabe repeated. "Erase the war." The officer reached for an eraser and began rubbing away the lines that connected the empire, from Manchuria to the Philippines, from Burma to the Pacific Islands. The pencil marks vanished, leaving the map pale and empty. When he finished, Kawabe stared at it for a long moment. "This," he said quietly, "is what defeat looks like." That evening, the emperor dined alone. The palace servants brought simple dishes, rice, pickles, miso soup. He ate little. When he was finished, he rose and walked to the veranda overlooking the garden. Fireflies glimmered above the pond, their light soft and indifferent. The faint hum of the city drifted through the trees. Weeping, singing, silence. Koichi Kido approached and bowed. "Majesty, the people have accepted your words with reverence." Hirohito nodded. "I have done only what was necessary." He turned his gaze to the horizon. "I spoke of peace, but what peace can exist among ruins? Kido hesitated. "Perhaps peace begins in silence, Majesty." The Emperor said nothing. His reflection wavered on the pond's surface. Not a god, not even a sovereign, but a man who had surrendered an empire to save what little remained of its soul. August 16th. Dawn. The first Allied aircraft appeared over Tokyo, unescorted, unarmed, flying low. They dropped not bombs, but leaflets, instructions for the occupation, assurances of safety. The papers drifted through the air like pale snow, settling on rooftops and craters alike. Children chased them through the streets. Some adults tore them up in anger. Others folded them carefully, as if they contained the future. In the barracks, soldiers sat before their officers, waiting for orders that would never come. One young recruit broke the silence. "Sir, what do we do now?" The captain looked at him with hollow eyes. "We live," he said. "That is the new order." He removed his sword and laid it on the floor. For a moment he stared at its reflection, the steel that had been his faith. Then he turned it aside, the gesture small but immense. Around him the men followed suit. One by one, blades met the ground. The sound was like rain beginning to fall after a long drought. In the ruins of Hiroshima, the few survivors who could still walk stood by the riverbanks, staring south toward the sea. They had heard the Emperor's voice too. Many wept without understanding why. For them, the war had already ended days ago in the flash that turned their city to glass. An old woman knelt beside the water, her face lit by the morning sun. "So he has saved us," she murmured. "Then may the dead forgive us." That afternoon, in the compound of the Ministry of War, the body of General Anami was laid to rest. The officers stood in silence as his coffin was carried out, draped in the national flag. No speeches were given. None were needed. Kawabe saluted. "He kept his word," he said quietly. Arisue nodded. "He died for loyalty." But in the end, even loyalty could not stop time. They stood together as the coffin disappeared down the corridor, the last soldier of the old empire departing into the shadows. Outside, Tokyo's streets were filled with an eerie calm. Vendors reopened their stalls. Children played among the rubble. The sound of hammers echoed faintly. People repairing roofs, mending doors, trying to rebuild something that might still be called a home. At a crossroads, a man in tattered uniform knelt and pressed his forehead to the ground. Beside him lay a photograph of his family, edges burned. Passers-by stopped, bowed silently, and moved on. Grief was no longer private. It belonged to everyone. In the evening, a light rain began to fall. It hissed softly against the ruins, cooling the scorched earth. The war's final fire was dying. At NHK headquarters, engineers played the Emperor's recording one last time, not for broadcast, but for themselves. They sat in silence, listening to the voice that had ended their world and given them another. When it finished, one technician whispered, "He sounded so calm." Another replied, "Perhaps that's what it takes to speak for millions." That night, Koichi Kido wrote again in his diary, "Today begins the true trial of Japan. We must learn to live without the sword." He paused, then added another line, "The people do not yet know whether to weep or to hope." He set down his brush and listened. Beyond the palace walls, the rain continued, steady and unending. Somewhere far away, a temple bell rang. The sound low, mournful, infinite. At the same hour, across the ruins of the capital, men who had once commanded armies sat alone with their memories. Some contemplated suicide. Others stared into nothing, unable to comprehend survival. General Umezu sat by the window of his quarters, watching the rain trace lines down the glass. His aide entered quietly, asking if he would eat. The old soldier shook his head. "The Emperor has spoken," he said. "We are now the defeated." He smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Strange, isn't it? We thought death would be the hardest thing, but living, that may be worse." By midnight, the rain had stopped. The moon emerged between drifting clouds, pale and distant. Over the darkened city, no sirens sounded, no guns fired. For the first time in years, the sky was at peace. In the palace garden, Hirohito walked alone once more. He paused beneath a tree still scarred by shrapnel and looked up at the stars. Their cold light shimmered faintly on the pond's surface. The Emperor closed his eyes. He saw the fires of Hiroshima, the vanished harbor of Nagasaki, the faces of his generals, his people bowing in the streets. He heard the silence that followed his words. that great, unbroken silence, and wondered if it was the sound of ending or of beginning. A breeze stirred the leaves. The world, for the first time in 15 years, was utterly still. At dawn, the first light touched the palace walls, washing them in gold. Across the city, roosters crowed, trains clattered weakly to life, and people stepped outside to face the morning. The war was over, though the memory of it would never fade. In the ruins of Tokyo, a child pointed toward the rising sun and whispered, "Look, it came back." And above the broken empire, the light of that new day spread slowly, quietly, over a land learning how to live again, over a land learning how to live again.